AsilemART here. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you some ways to use clipping masks and locking layers to help keep your edges clean and speed up your painting process. I'm going to be using this rough sketch of my antagonist, the Queen Shark, from my Winway Tales series, so the line work on this is not the cleanest, but that doesn't matter. It works just fine for what we'll be doing. So the first thing we want to do before we dive into either of these is to create a silhouette, or I call it a blockout. Basically, you want to fill in the whole form of whatever the space is you want to color within. And there's two ways you can fill in your silhouette. First is to paint it all in by hand, which can take a bit of time, but if this is easier for you, it gets the job done. The second way is to paint along the edges of your line art. Then turn off your line art and make sure that there aren't any spaces where parts are not overlapping around the edges. Then use the fill tool to fill in the silhouette. Whichever way you choose to do this, you want to ensure you don't have any missed spots because then you're going to get white dots in your painting. A good way to check for this is to make the blockout layer a selection by holding Control and clicking on the white box on the layer. And the racing lines are going around the blockout, but you can see I have some spots showing up inside my blockout, and I don't want that. So I can easily hit Control D to deselect and fill in those spots. And then select the layer again with Control and clicking on the white box, and keep going back and forth until the racing lines are only around the outsides of my blockout. And make sure to name my layer. Alright, so first up I'm going to talk about locking layers. Once you have your blockout layer finished, above in the layers panel, click on the little lock with a checkered box behind it called Lock Transparent Pixels. This locks the pixels for that layer, so if I were to color here, it will now stay within my form that I painted on this blockout layer. But if I create a new layer above that and paint on it, you can see the lines are going outside of the blockout. Locking layers is a useful tool to toggle on and off as you go. Like, for instance, let's pretend I painted this up and wanted to just paint her hair. Because I have her hair blocked out on an isolated layer, it is easy to lock that layer and just paint her hair. Versus if I did this without locking it, I have to be very careful and may have to go back and erase along the edge, which you can do too, but being able to lock the layer is a useful way to keep edges clean on your work and save time. I admittedly don't use locks that often. I do both a blockout and then in a separate folder I paint all my color blocks and flat colors in on isolated layers. So that gives me the option to do an effect to the whole piece or just parts using selections like how we did earlier. The downside with lock layers is having to paint everything on one layer, and if you're like me and you like a lot of layers, this approach may not appeal to you. So this is where clipping masks come in. Clipping masks work a lot like lock layers, except you can use them across many layers. To use a clipping layer, you still have to begin with a blockout. So we're going to go back to that original blockout layer and make sure your transparent lock is off. To apply a clipping layer, you want to create a new layer above that blockout, and on that new layer, you want to select this little icon here that's like a box within a box that says Clip to Layer Below. And now when I color, it stays within the blockout. And the beauty of clipping layers is that I can keep going and add more layers with this and keep clipping them to that bottom layer, and they're all going to stay within that blockout. You can also clip group folders to the blockout layer instead of each individual layer. I like to do it this way, and now I can keep all of her parts separated, and then I can adjust any colors or make selections of specific parts later on if I need to. I can add more layers in this clip folder. For example, I can lay in my shadow work on a multiply layer, and I don't have to stress about staying in the lines. It fills in quickly. This technique works really well for these kind of line art pieces. You can still clip layers above this group to keep rendering. You can even do this within many groups if you wanted. Everything will clip back to that blockout layer. Using clipping and locking layers can even affect your paint strokes because you're being careful to stay in the lines rather than just brushing past them. So let's say on this new clipped layer above the group, I wanted to add in some reflective light in the shadow side. When the layer is clipped, I can be very loose with each brush pass. Where if I didn't have it clipped and tried to do this, I'm painting differently, making smaller passes, and even using a smaller brush to try to stay within the lines and not create more work for myself, having to go back and erase along the edges. And you don't have to be a slave to the blockout. If you have more organic parts that go outside of the blockout and clipped layers, such as stray kind of flyaway hairs or something, you can simply add those in on a new layer that is not clipped. So for example's sake, let's just say she had these 2 stray hairs by her face, and I wanted to change the color because they are catching in the light. Now I can even lock this layer and easily paint over it, and it's not going to affect anything else. This would be an example of how you could use the lock layer as you go. And this approach with clipping layers and lock layers doesn't just work for characters, you can use it for backgrounds too. My character is going to be in water, so below all my other layers I can make a new layer and paint in a shape just like I did with the blockout layer. Then I can make a new layer above it, clip it, and I can keep painting in the background, and it's going to stay in the shape I painted in the layer below. And I can keep doing that with whatever else I would put in here. Again, for example, let's say I wanted some sort of rock in here. On a new layer, I can create a rough block out of the shape, then create a new layer above it, clip it, and keep painting just to see how it would look, and then I can always come back and refine it later. So hopefully this gives you some ideas for how to use these tools in your process. They're there to help keep your edge work clean and allow you to paint faster while also not having to spend time cleaning up by racing around the edges, which could be very frustrating, right? I totally encourage you to give this a go, and don't be intimidated or daunted by it. To get set up doing the silhouette and isolated color blocking only takes me about 10 minutes, and that 10 minutes cuts down so much time in the rendering process going forward. So I hope this helps to cut down some of your time too. Thanks for watching, and happy painting!